Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top 3 so keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is going to be ElkY, who is at the moment more known as a poker pro, but he used to be a StarCraft pro back in the day. And believe it or not, I'm talking about old school StarCraft, not StarCraft 2, original StarCraft Brood War. And he actually is one of the rare people, along with Grrrr, which is probably the most awkward name to ever actually pronounce, I've just realised, except if it's written down. And obviously, he was actually playing back in the day in the real scene. Like, if everyone knows all the Korean pros, he was playing against them. He wasn't just playing on Team Liquid or online cops in the West or Battle.net. So, ElkY, the first thing I want to ask you is this, is I noticed, right, in a lot of interviews you've done, one of the themes of this interview, and it's a theme of your career and Grrr's, is that when you guys became pros in StarCraft, it was in the really early days. And so this was basically before Koreans took over totally. And part of why they took over, from my understanding, is, I mean, people kind of know about Koreans. They have amazing work ethic at playing video games. And so I noticed when I talked to Guillaume, he basically made it sound like, you know, in the early days, it was fun to compete with them. But then later, once like it just became like a really hard job, things like poker and things outside of the game became more appealing. They became more fun. Now, I wondered if there was some of this involved in your youth, because I saw in an interview a long time ago, actually, when you just finished being a pro, you described it as like when you thought that like the reason you stopped playing was similar, like you had to practice too much and Koreans practice too much. And I noticed when you did a different interview with Laura, actually, who does the LEC now in League of Legends, you said that like when you were young, you were one of these people where you wanted to do like an academic career, but I think it was your brother or something told you like, oh, you have to study really hard like once you get to this level, and you were like, yeah, maybe not. And I saw in this old interview, right, this really old one, similar to this, you said that, I mean, you described yourself in French. You said like you're un joueur de l'âme, which is like a gamer at heart, player at heart, basically. Are you someone who's like a lot of gamers? Are you like really talented, but you're a bit lazy?
I wouldn't say I'm so lazy. You know, I don't know. It's like, I think going to Korea actually made me a much harder worker, because I guess I was lazy when I was younger. I was kind of lazy at school. I guess I'm lazy in the topics that I'm not so interested in.
Sure.
You know? So I was always like kind of lucky, because I was understand things really quick, but I would pretty much never work. You know, like I would play like video games all night and like sleep a few hours and do my homework like 1 hour before going to school in the morning or something. But yeah, I wouldn't say. I think going to Korea at such a young age actually had a really big influence on me, and because Koreans have such hard work ethics, and everybody is like working so hard, and it's basically like win or die pretty much, you know.
Sure.
That it had a very positive influence on me. I think if I didn't go there, I would probably not be working as hard. But the reason why I decided to, of course, like when I was young, you know, like studying is not so appealing. And I think when I made this interview, I was right. And then my brother told me like I have to study a lot. And it's not so much studying things that bothered me, is that I didn't really like have a career path or something I was as passionate as in gaming. And I kind of realized that you know, I'm like 18, and if I'm gonna take my chance like being a pro gamer, it's pretty much now. And if I study hard for 2-3 years and then get a job, it's pretty much like I would never be able to try it. So I thought it would be like, I thought it was a really good risk reward opportunity. You know, worst case scenario, I don't make it and I have fun for 2 years and I go back to study after. And best case scenario, of course, then I can live the dream of everyone back then. So I think that's more what it is, yeah. But going back to like the reason I quit. So there is some truth, of course, to what you said. It's not so much that. So it's kind of everything together. Of course, like the game became, actually when I came to Korea, it was already tougher. I came like a couple of years after Guillaume. I moved in 2001, right after I visited in 2000 for WCG challenge, I believe, and then I moved in 2001. after the WCG when I got second place behind Boxer in Milan. So that's when I moved full time, and Guillaume was, I believe Guillaume he moved in like 98 or 99. So when I moved in, it was already like much harder because the Koreans they were already pretty much dominant. So I forgot where I was going. Yeah, so basically like the why I quit, there was a few reasons. Of course, it was like getting much tougher, but also our team, we kind of had the disagreement with our manager, and he forced us to get a deal that we didn't really love, a sponsorship deal, because we didn't need him. I mean, he had a wife and kids, so basically he will get money if we get this deal. So he needed more than us. We were like young and stupid, and like, oh, it's okay, we can live without money. We do whatever we want, you know. So the last deal that we had to, for example, we had to go to open internet cafe all over Korea. It was with like a internet cafe chain.
Yeah, sure.
iVenture, and we had to open internet cafe all over Korea, which is like, if you drive 30 minutes and you play StarCraft with fans and sign pictures, it's really cool and it's fun. But sometimes on weekend you go to Busan and you drive, it's like 4 to 5 hours to go there, 4 to 5 hours to go back, you know, and you get paid like $200 and you spend like 10 hours like driving back and forth. It's really like, I don't know, it was kind of miserable. It was kind of miserable to do it again and again. You can't even practice. And at the same time, the Pro League, on-game Pro League was getting bigger, and some Koreans in our team, they had to go to the army because they all have to go for 26 months in Korea. Sure. And because they were not, I remember when Boxer went there, they made a special Air Force team for him, yes. But he was the only one. Other Koreans, course, no matter how good they were, they pretty much had to go to the army and not play StarCraft. So because of that, and also Grrrr was playing a little bit less, and we lost a bit of motivation. And poker came at the exact same time, you know, and it was like new and exciting and gave us like so much freedom, and also the ability to travel the world, which is like something really, it's really exciting and something I always wanted to do. And I love StarCraft so much, but StarCraft was, as you said, it was really tough. We pretty much like were off like only 2 weeks out of the entire year, and you had to play on, you had to practice for tournaments really hard, which was really fun. Of course, we loved the game, but I kind of miss the poker. It gave us like so much more freedom, and we didn't have to rely on the manager and team, and pretty much were doing what we wanted. So at the beginning, I wanted to play poker and StarCraft at the same time, but then I quickly realized that it was not. StarCraft is such a competitive game, and it's so difficult that if you don't practice like at least 8 to 10 hours a day, there's no way you can be at the top of the game.
I mean, one theme that emerges from what you just said there is obviously the idea that, like, I mean, a lot of people will know the very famous quote that says, you know, if you find something you love, you don't have to work a day in your life because it doesn't feel like work. You know, you're into it, you're passionate about it, right? One of the things I think that's interesting about this that ties into your early time in StarCraft is I looked up and saw that actually in the beginning, like a lot of people, like Grrrr himself used to do this, you basically at the beginning of the game didn't just play one race. You used to race swap, play random, like you started playing Protoss and stuff. And I even saw that at one point in one of the early tournaments, you even actually did like, you played Protoss against like a Terran just to fucking with the matchups in like one of the Star League games or something. So was StarCraft initially not like something that was like a hardcore game you were playing? Were you just playing it for the fun of playing it? Because in the modern day, you know, any RTS, nobody would play random now. You pick a race and you just stick to it, and you only play that one race.
It was fun, but we were playing really hard and practicing like crazy, actually. It was insane, you know, back in the days. I don't know if you're familiar, but when the first tournament, there was not even observer mode. There was not even replay, so there was no replays and there was no observer mode. So to learn the tricks of the trade, basically, you have to like observe the best players. But I don't know if you're familiar with the details, but you know, one very popular map was Lost Temple.
Of course, classic, yeah.
So it's a 4 players map, and most of the games they played heads up. So basically what we were doing is that there was like 4 players joining, and 2 guys, they pick Terran and they leave their command center and they hide in the corner, and then they get shared vision, and that's how you learn.
Right.
And basically, like, the top players, they will play, and then there will be like huge waiting lists because everybody want to watch them, right? And there's only 2 players that can watch, and there's no replay. So sometimes I will just be online like for like 4 or 5 hours just waiting. I can't even start a game because what if I wait and I'm on waiting list and I cannot watch them play? It's like it's crazy. So I would pretty much be online like I don't know, like 16, 18 hours a day for like many months. Before I went to Korea. So of course it was fun, but it was also like crazy hard work, and maybe it's quite there's no random player now. I'm not sure. It's because I mean players they identify more to races, and I don't think the island maps there. I think the balance back then it was much less optimal than nowadays as well. So
I mean, basically, Protoss was OP on any island map because you could just fly around.
Yeah,
basically,
Protoss was
Yeah.
really OP on island map. So I would play Protoss on island against Zerg, and
Sure.
and I think now the balance is quite different as well. So there's much less incentive for players to practice another race than their main one.
Along these lines, in the early days of when he was in Korea and was having all his success, another thing Yom said that made it sound like this is another reason he lost some of his passion for the game is not only did you have to work very hard, but as you just alluded to, because there didn't used to be replays and there wasn't an easy way where if you invented something, everyone in the world could just download it and be like, oh yeah, I saw exactly what you did then, and they have your build order, etc. He said like back in the day, it didn't feel like you had to like maximize every area. Like you didn't have to have the best APM. You didn't have to know every single strategy. The idea was you could be a bit more like an artist, you know. You could just do something amazing in the moment, and then even a really good Korean player, they might not have seen all your demos. They might not know everything you do. So it was a little bit freer back then. Was it like that actually by the time you'd got there?
When I got there, it was replays were just coming out, yeah, and also like replays, but also like TV game, obviously, like there's observers, so they pretty much, even when there was no replays and the games were on TV, you could see everything. But that's true that it made the game like much more competitive, and you kind of have to work harder because everybody knows every single build order, so everything is much more optimized after pretty much when like the game became really big and there were like big games on TV and replays, and you have to optimize everything, because back then you could play like heads up where when you play like a game with someone and then you lose, sometimes you're like, oh man, how do you do this? You're like wondering, and you have to like. So I guess there where Guillaume is right is that there were more like adaptation and more a little bit. It was a little bit more skewed towards the raw skill as opposed to the hard work. Obviously, like I would never say that the top StarCraft players, they're not skilled. They're all like extremely good, but the hard work became like really, really important because of all the information that you could gather online, which was not necessarily available before.
Right, one thing I thought was interesting is a lot of people are not going to know, because this is such old school StarCraft talk here, that even people who played Brood War later won't realise, right? One of the most famous things about Boxer is that when he became the champion, people who played Terran weren't champions back then. Like Protoss was strong, Zerg at the very beginning of the game was very strong. Like that's one of the things that famously, like his dropship usage, etc., made him so famous. Why were you a Terran player when you went to Korea initially? Was it not harder initially?
It was harder, but actually, like Zerg was a really popular race for Korean players, and I thought like Terran against Zerg is a matchup that was fitting my style much more. Like Protoss Zerg was quite harder on most of the maps, and the way the Korean players played is that they were obviously they evolved later, but they were not as macro focused when I went there. So if you could. By playing Terran, you could usually out macro them and play a little bit more defensive style, and which was really really harder. Protoss against Zerg was a pretty hard matchup on most of the maps back then. So that's the main reason why I picked Terran. Yeah.
So obviously one of the key moments, and probably the reason that you basically got this chance to have this career in Korea, is the World Cyber Games, where you made this amazing run. You came second, lost to Boxer twice, right? And obviously, if people don't know, even in that tournament, you had to beat Koreans. Like you had to beat people who later became champions, like Go Rush and all these sorts of players. Was that a moment that you understood at the time? Like, did you know that you were good enough to go that far? Did you actually think you could have beaten Boxer?
That day I couldn't have beat him. I beat him later, but not many. I think my overall record against Boxer is 2 wins and 12 losses, so so not very good. But back in that day, I don't think I could have beat him. You know, it was just a combination of everything. It was a much better StarCraft player, of course, and also he had so much experience. It's actually quite difficult because of the pressure that you know, like we were playing the World Cyber game was the final. Actually, there were only like I think 1,000 people in the audience, but then you play like in front of a big stage and it's on TV and everybody watch, and you play against the best player in the world, and as soon as you make a mistake, everybody cheers, because if you lose one unit, they cheer because they're all rooting for him.
Sure.
Because he was like the favorite of every player back then.
Yeah, he's the hero, yeah.
So the fact that he was better than me and the pressure that I wasn't that used to it, I think there was no chance I could have won. I don't think I played. I mean, even if I played my best game, my A game, I don't think I could have won, and I probably played like B or C because I was just very intimidated and like under a lot of pressure. Yeah.
Do you think that is a factor in your career in general? Because I've noticed when you talk in poker interviews, you often reference what you just said there, that you think actually StarCraft sort of hardened you to becoming like the life of a pro. Because as you say, if people don't know, in your career, you basically never won the big championships. You got to a lot of like semi-finals, you made the final here, in the Star Leagues you were in the semi-finals, but that's the point if people don't know. In Korea, these are like TV shows, but then once they get to the semi-finals and on is when you start going in the big stadiums, you have the bigger crowds, and as you say, if you're playing against like the biggest Korean name, every fan's going to be against you, unfortunately. Maybe there's some fans back in America watch you online, but like every fan in the building is going to want the other guy to win. Did it make it more challenging? Because I noticed some of the people that you would lose to in those matches, you might beat them elsewhere if it was like a one-off match or a show match or a smaller game, but in these games they usually got the better of you.
Yeah, actually I think like against Boxer it definitely intimidated me, but after this I think I got better, and in general I think I perform better under pressure, and I'm able to focus more, and I like when there's a lot of things at stakes, which is something that roll over to poker as well. You know, I like when you're playing for big stakes, or when the match is really important, when the game is really important, and but that's really definitely something that's very underestimated by a lot of the audience, of the fans. Like they think because a player is like the best in absolute skill that he will always win. But I know like
Sure.
there were a lot of players that we were practicing with back then. Let's say in practice games, maybe they would beat me like 70% of the time, and when we will go on stage, it's like totally reversed. They will win like maybe 2 or 3 times out of 10 because they choke, and because it's very hard to perform the same as you play in like practice game when you relax at home and you're just basically like playing your best. And when you're on a big stage, of course it's very destabilizing. But not only that, just knowing that you play a game that could change your career and that could be defining your career, a lot of players, it's quite difficult to handle sometimes. So I think that's very underestimated, this aspect. But in general, I would say that StarCraft hardened me, and after the first 6 months, and I got pretty used to it. So I definitely wouldn't say that I never won the championship because I had to play in a stadium or under pressure. It's not fair to the players who beat me. You know, they were just better players back in the days.
Okay. Since, as you say, like Boxer was a frequent person who, at the time, because he was the best player, you had to go through him if you're going to try and win the championship, and he won most of the big matches. What was he like at his prime? What was his strengths? What was good about his game?
He was like he was the best because I mean he was obviously like extremely hardworking, like all the Korean, but he was also super creative, and he would just come with like strategy out of nowhere, and like come up with things that nobody thought about it before. And basically like a lot of a lot of the Terran Zerg matchup, he was defined by the build orders and the move that Boxer invented. Like the use of dropship, as you said, and like the fact that you would just like be able to micro them so well. Like my style, for example, Terran Zerg was completely different. It was more like a macro game and try to like gain an advantage, more like an economic advantage on my opponents. And then Boxer was pretty much like putting his opponents under maximum pressure and finding weakness anywhere to take advantage of. But of course, he was like, yeah. So I would think that was like the, I think his main strength. But there's also the psychological effect, because he has such a huge aura and he was like pretty much the god of StarCraft for so many years. Like the psychological effect, like it's pretty strong. Like a lot of players, just because they played against Boxer, they're like, oh, I cannot win anyway. So they would just try, like, even if they had a chance to win, they would just be destabilized because they know they play against Boxer and they kind of have to try some all-in build because they don't think they have a chance. So it's actually like worked in his favor as well, I think.
Now, your other main person you often met up with, another classic rival, was also Boxer's rival, Yellow, the classic Zerg player. Now, here's what's interesting about this, is he was someone who people might remember back in the day, as you alluded to before, like Terran versus Zerg has nearly always been favoured towards Terran. That's just the way the matchups go. Like each race gets its own one. It's got a slight advantage in. I noticed in interviews back in the day, you were actually very complimentary of this player. So what was it about him? I mean, obviously the fact that he's winning a matchup that in theory he's supposed to be not as favoured in racially. Like, what was he so good at? What impressed you about Yellow?
Yeah, I think Yellow, he was the one. He was also able to. He was much more adaptive than the other Zerg players. Pretty much the other Zerg players back in the day, they were like all like. They were like this kind of meta game, and it was like a little bit stale, and they were like all try the similar build order. But Yellow, he was really able to. He was doing some things that you would never expect other players to do against Terran back in the day, and like the switch that he will do, and with a combination of units, and he was able to. He was also like. Like back then, there were a lot of Zerg players. They will either go like zoning Mutalisk or like Hydra Lurker, and they were not basically when they would go like for one, they were not able to switch so much within the game. But Yellow, he was able to switch really fast from one unit combination to the other. So it was really hard to play against him because that's a big strength of Zerg is that basically if they can switch units, they can just remake the army like much faster. And for Terran, because of the way the race is designed, if you go for one unit composition and you have to switch, it's very difficult. It's very slow to make the switch usually because the buildings are not the same to produce the units. So you kind of if you want to make science vessels to fight Mutalisk, for example, then it's pretty slow. You pretty much have to make them the entire game, and you can't just like switch right away when you see what your brand is doing. It's harder.
Now, since obviously, like, it's impossible to basically talk about this period in your career without referencing Guillaume as well. And as you say, he arrived before you, and he'd become the champion of the first Star League. And then, as I said, when I did an interview, I'll link the interview actually in the description box if people are watching this video. One of the very interesting things about this interview is Guillaume is actually very open about the fact that after he had his initial success and he became like a celebrity for being a foreigner that was having success in this game, he basically just openly says like he would just party too much and he would be out in clubs and with celebrities and stuff, and he wasn't putting in the hours to practice. Now, when you got there, in your first year, you had all this success. Wouldn't that have overlapped with that? Was he still practicing hard when you initially got there? Did that rub off on you? Because, I mean, you kind of like kept it going a bit longer than him, but that must have made it a bit awkward, right?
Yeah, for sure. I would practice really hard when I got there for much longer than Guillaume. I guess I would say maybe the last year I didn't practice as when I first started playing poker. Then I gradually practiced less. But I think for the first 2.5, 3 years, I practiced like pretty much all the time. I was like, Guillaume, why are you doing? Why don't you play the game? And he's like, oh, it's too hard. But yeah, I understand his. He had a lot of success and he had a really good sponsor, and it was also really exciting life, and I think that's kind of was a downfall of a lot of StarCraft players. Actually, like they would like play so hard because it's really hard to. It's such a competitive game, and once you're on top, you have to keep practicing so hard. But a lot of the time, they will get like better contracts, and they will be like a little bit. They were pretty much relaxing on their training a little bit, and that's why there are not that many of them who stood the test of time. For example, like some guys like Savior, they were like the best for a very short period of time.
Sure.
But like the most dedicated one, like Boxer, Yellow, and Nada, they were able to shine for many years.
I actually heard something along these lines, which is that basically, right, the problem is obviously esports itself is big in Korea and still is big to this day, but I've basically, as far as I can tell, it was big in a different way there, because when I actually lived there for a few years and I asked loads of people that I met, especially people who you wouldn't think would know about esports, like did they know esports? Most of them didn't know esports actually, but they knew StarCraft 1, and that was the thing. What everyone told me was StarCraft was like a cultural phenomenon where it's like everyone when they were 12 played the game basically, and so everyone sort of knew it in their past. I mean, I would make the equivalent, even though it's like not a great analogy, but people will get it. Like even in the West, if someone's not a gamer, they probably know like Pokemon or something. They probably played that when they were a kid, it's culturally, but it doesn't mean they know every game. They're not a hardcore gamer. So the key difference here is, while like some people, if they're into esports, would know the big esports stars now and might follow the games, back then I've heard that basically StarCraft 1, when it popped off, for real, you could like, girls in nightclubs and shit would just be like, oh, you play StarCraft? Yeah, I do as well. Like my brother does or something. Like, was it as crazy? Was it as ubiquitous as this in the whole scene?
Yeah, it was really crazy. Actually, almost everybody we met was a fan and knew us, and it was insane. Like, it was just like you would just go to a bar and like usually the bartender know you, and then they make special show for you guys because you're in town, and like all the girls, like when you tell them you play StarCraft, they all knew and they all play too. They all have a race. They're like, oh yeah, I'm Terran, I'm Poros, and so on. So it was just like, it was much bigger than like any esport back now, I think, because it was really cultural phenomenon. I think it was the only game back in the days in Korea, right? Because there was when Korea, like the internet cafe were popping everywhere, and I think back in the days, like Quake, it wasn't allowed because it was like supposedly too violent. So pretty much everybody was playing StarCraft, and because they didn't also have that much space, because in Seoul in Korea, it's very densely populated. So pretty much like all the kids, when they're done with school, they just go with their friends to instead of going playing sport or doing anything else, they would just go to internet cafe and they would all play StarCraft together. So it was like really crazy. Actually, it felt like a different world, like lived in Korea and like everybody knows about StarCraft, and it's just like the more standard thing. You have like back then I had fans who were like 40 or 45 years old guys who were like stopping me in the middle of the street to congratulate me and to ask for an autograph. And then a few times I would go back to France, and then like some guys ask what I'm doing. I'm like a professional gamer, and they're like, what is this? Like,
sure.
Oh, it's not a job, get out of here. Like,
oh, well, that one thing I want to ask was this, along these lines, right? You were already known, actually, when you were just at the World Cyber Games, for having this flair. So, like, famously, like, just like now, you always had, like, dyed hair and stuff, and you used to famously, like, wear shades even while you were playing, like, Oakley sunglasses, right? You already would have been popular like Guillaume was, because you were a foreigner and you were winning in Korea, and Koreans, actually, it's very weird, because on the one hand, they can be very insular, but as a result, if someone comes to Korea and embraces Korea, they love them, like, they go super crazy for that shit. So, do you think, actually, that, like, your kind of showmanship played into your popularity as well?
It played a little bit, yeah. I think so, and I think I definitely took advantage of it, and it kind of made it easier for us foreigner to some extent, because it was like we were more popular with a sponsor. Because basically the Koreans, unless you're like Yellow Boxer or like Breach or like unless you're like top 5 players, there was no interest of sponsoring any Korean player, right? That's also what made the game so hard. Like StarCraft is just so hard, because if you're not like top 5 or 10 in the world, you cannot really make a living out of it. So I kind of took advantage of it, and I think my showmanship and the fact that I was already different, of course, and that I did some effort to look even more different, then it helped. And like it helps getting some invites, like especially early on before I got big results in the Star League and so on. It helps a lot because for like there were like a lot of these exhibition show on TV network, and if you look different and you're like, if you have like very different personality and style, then you're more likely to get invited because it's more fun for the show, I guess.
Yeah, actually, that's something I was going to ask you about. I noticed even when you weren't the best player, you were always getting invited to those invite matches. Like, they were always putting you against Boxer in another game, or Nada, or Yellow, all the big names, right? They wanted to just see everyone play against you, basically.
Yeah, it was because of the image, and also because we're foreigners, and like I guess also Koreans, they like to. So we still had a lot of fun, even though it was nothing compared to like Yellow and Boxer. But also, I guess they want to showcase they're the best in the world. So if there's like really good foreigner,
right, sure,
and they can still beat him, it's like
okay.
how good Koreans are. It's so I guess everybody was happy with this situation, right?
The interesting thing is, though, even though
for them it's just more interesting to show like Boxer beating one of the best European and foreign players, and Boxer like beating like a random Korean guy,
Even though, as you just said there, like you could get invites to certain things like that, one thing that I actually wanted to stress and ask you about this interview is, if people don't know, one thing I always thought was amazing about the Korean scene back then was it was a real sport. Like, you had to qualify for every Star League, or MSL or OSL that you ever played in. Everyone did. In fact, that's the craziest thing. Even when the great players would fall off, they didn't just give them an invite to the next tournament. Like, they would have to go through the open qualifiers, which, as you're saying, there was loads of people playing in these. Like, if you go and look back at the people you had to play to even qualify into OSLs, these are the people who become the champions years later. Like, it was a really competitive scene, right? So the grind, if people don't know, to even get into an OSL is pretty crazy, right?
Yeah, it was extremely hard. I mean, like, basically, like, after that, they made a second league, and I think that's what they have. They made a Challenger League, but the qualification, they were like almost as hard as the Star League. The level was super high, and it was extremely competitive, and it was super hard to get a seat and to qualify. Like, you kind of have to be like, it was so competitive, and you kind of had to be lucky. You had to like fight the right opponent and find a good matchup at the right time, and it made because all the level everything was so close, and everybody was practicing so hard that you needed like a little bit of luck on your side, like because a lot of players says StarCraft, there's no luck in StarCraft, which is mostly true. Like, the best player win most of the time, but when the skill levels are like so close and everybody practice 8 to 10 hours a day and know every single build order perfectly, then there is a little bit of luck involved, unfortunately.
Now, that's obviously also a thing that people won't be aware of, which is that, as you said, when you said one of the reasons you quit, like those extra sponsorship obligations you had where you had to travel around, etc. If people don't know, the most ridiculous thing about being a StarCraft pro is, beyond even just the practice hours, the sheer number of official games you play is crazy. Like, you don't just play the OSLs, etc. Then you were in a team league, obviously, with this team you were in. You have to qualify for the OSLs. You play the show matches. Like, I'm going to guess in a year, you might play like hundreds of days a year, just the official matches, right?
Yeah, if you're doing good, you play 100 of days or with an exhibition match, probably sometimes even more. Like, Boxer will go on, like, it will be on TV or live show like 5 days a week, pretty much, because the Star League there were like two major leagues. Was the Star League and the on-game Star League and the NBC Star League. They were like one game a week, but then like you mostly had like another like a exhibition game during the week, and then you had some qualifications for other leagues. So it's like, yeah, it was really, really intense. And actually sometimes it's like it became so intense that because when you play these was like Star Leagues, and usually you have to the maps in advance, so you can focus your practicing. You need like so you need like at least a week to practice well on the specific matchup on the specific map. Sometimes there are like some other smaller tournaments that are like, I don't want to play it because I want to practice for the Star League and I don't have time. And it was really intense, yeah.
Did you ever, at this time, I mean, I know it was only for a couple of years, but did you ever experience burnout? Did you get too stressed, or did it take a toll on you, or did you handle it? Did you adapt, kind of like weight training? What was it like?
No, I wouldn't say burnout. I mean, at the very end, I think the obligation for the sponsor, it was much worse, because I love playing StarCraft, but like being stuck, I never liked being in a car actually. So being stuck in a car like 10 hours a day, and I'm not able to practice, and I'm like, it felt like I was like a little bit wasting my time, But yeah, I wouldn't say I really got burnout, but definitely it's not as stressful, but because I love the competition and I love what I was doing, but it's definitely like, when you like 0-9 against Boxer and you have to face him again, you're like, oh God, what am I gonna do? It's like it doesn't really feel good to be in that spot.
When you said that line, and it's a great line, like there's not much luck in StarCraft, but obviously there is if you just play like a bunch of people who are like number 1, number 2, number 3, and they all play a million games. Yeah, there's going to be like small amount of luck will become relevant there. As I referenced before, if you go and look at your career, even though you didn't win an OSL or an MSL, the amount of champions or future champions that you did beat in games or in series or show matches or whatever, you beat a lot of them. So do you feel as though, like, is there another way your career could have gone? Could you have had a run like Grrrr did at the beginning of the game and won one of these championships, do you think?
I think maybe if I went there a couple of years before, like my friend Guillaume, then that would have been possible. I mean, I try not to think so much about it. I was like, for like the vast majority of my career, I was giving up everything I could, and I was doing my best. And maybe I could have won, but I could also have like never made it to the top 3 in on-game Star League, or I could have got unlucky. And if I didn't make it to the final against Boxer in the WCG, you never know what can happen. So I think it can go both ways. I probably had some lucky matchups, and it's about the matchup and also the map, because the map draw back in the days, I think now the system is much better with like there's veto and so on.
Yes.
But before the on-game Star League is pretty much like you draw an opponent random and a map random. So like obviously there are opponents which are not the match.
Right.
There are some map which favors matchups pretty heavily, and it could be a huge influence depending on the map we do. Especially I think the pools were like that. I think when you make like the quarterfinals, and it's like a regular best of 3, so you have more maps. But yeah, I think maybe I got unlucky, maybe I got lucky. I think overall I was satisfied with the effort I did, and it was like pretty much amazing experience. Yeah.
Now, when I interviewed Guillaume, like I said, he was very frank, and he basically said like as if to make an example of how ridiculous he got with like partying and not being as serious as a pro. He told me he literally did stuff like just wake up like hungover on a bench in a park and just be like, oh, better go home now. Like he was just doing those sorts of crazy nights out, which obviously wouldn't be conducive to the kind of lifestyle you're talking about if you're playing versus people who are just playing, it's their whole life. They just play 14 hours a day. Were you diligent? Were you ever a naughty boy in that sense? Did you ever try to have a little bit of a rock and roll lifestyle?
But not quite as much as Guillaume. Yeah, I went out with him a few times. Yeah, for sure. Maybe I think like I would say, in average, maybe I went out like a couple times a month, maybe a little bit more. It depends. Like of course, like when there are some friends, like when after the WCG, for example, when I got second place, and there's still a lot of friends in town in Korea, and it's like you also want to have fun with them, and it's like such a different world, and it's very exciting. But overall, I think I partied a bit more when I started playing poker as opposed to playing StarCraft. Yeah.
I actually saw as well a detail a lot of people won't know, which is I knew this from just the history of esports, but one of the most interesting things about Korea in esports is that Warcraft 3 was never a big game in Korea because there was this whole thing where like there was a cheating scandal, and it was actually China it became big in, so instead it was StarCraft. But when the game first came out, they did try to do some initial leagues, and I saw that you actually did quite well in like one of the first ever ones. So like, was Warcraft 3 an interesting game to you? If that had become a big game in Korea, would you have preferred that game over StarCraft? What do you think?
No, actually, so like we were invited for some events in Taiwan by Blizzard for Warcraft 3, so I played the game, and it was quite fun, but it was really imbalanced, and pretty much like I was playing it because Warcraft 3 never really gave credit, but I was playing it because it was so easy, and compared to StarCraft, I didn't need to practice so much. So I was just like, oh, this game is so easy. I just played, and I got second place in the Star League, practicing like, I don't know what I mean, like 1/10 of the amount of time I played StarCraft. So it was in Korea. It was pretty much like Warcraft 3 for all the guys who can't really make it in StarCraft. Back in the days, everybody was not as good to play StarCraft as the top players. They're all like playing Warcraft 3. So, but it became pretty hard. Like I got second in the first Star League, but then like obviously like even if some Koreans, they were not good enough to make it in StarCraft, then after a while like you cannot play both. Like I was able to play it competitively for maybe like 6 months or so, and then it was just like the game evolved, and also it was pretty imbalanced when I played as well. Like the Night Elves with the Demon Hunter and the Moonwell, it was pretty OP. So. But yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why it never worked out. Like, but Koreans, they basically like didn't really respect Warcraft 3 as a game so much. But I think that was a fun game. But there was a lot of things also that made it like, I don't know, competitively, it was definitely not as a great game as StarCraft.
It's funny because you can always tell the people who don't actually know like the poker world, because if people were fans of StarCraft, when they used to hear these stories of like the really good players switching over and becoming poker pros, they would always be like, oh, that sucks. Why did they do that? Like, why didn't they stay playing StarCraft? It's like, if you actually think about it, there's a very logical way to explain it, which is you don't, in StarCraft, like you say, you have to basically be top 10, and let's be real, probably top 5 if you want to make good money. And you have to practice all day to be top 50. Whereas in poker, I mean, everyone knows you have to be the best just at a table, at any level. You can make lots of money. You can set your own hours. It's got like a lot of the appeals of StarCraft, right? But without a lot of the downside of StarCraft.
Yeah, of course. And also I really loved Korea, and I think it was a wonderful place and a wonderful experience. But you pretty much had to move to Korea to be a StarCraft professional back in the day. I can see that it doesn't fit for a lot of players that don't necessarily want to start a new life and to leave their family and everything behind and move to Korea. It's pretty hard. Whereas like poker, you could just play online and be a professional. Like the amount of freedom it gave, it was the amount of freedom and the skill set that you can use from being a good StarCraft player to a good poker player. It's just basically like because now, like actually now Yellow and Boxer, they both also are poker players.
Right. That was actually one thing I was going to ask you about, because another thing that people probably won't know, because it's quite an obscure detail, is that in Korea, it's not really sort of like legal to gamble if you're Koreans in casinos. If you go there, it's always like foreigners and Westerners, right? Is it actually illegal?
Yeah, it's really weird. So there are casinos actually in Korea, and if you don't have a Korean passport, you can go freely. But when you get in, then you check your ID. If you're Asian, then check your ID, and then if you have a Korean passport, you're not allowed. So if you Korean with an American passport, you're allowed to play in the casino. But if you're Korean with a Korean passport, you cannot get in the casino and gamble, which is like, that's really weird. I guess they're trying to protect the Korean, because they really love to gamble.
Sure.
But online, obviously, it's a little bit it's quite a gray area. I think it's not either.
You can get around it.
There's no real law around it, I think.
Because that was the thing that's sort of funny, is that obviously at the time when you guys switched over and became successful in poker, you might think, why don't the Koreans just do it? But as we're saying here, like, it wasn't really something that they thought of, right? They just kind of were stuck in the world of, I'm just playing StarCraft.
Yeah, it was difficult. It was like it's a current. I mean, like the game in the casino, they were not that big because we were playing mostly online, and they're not that big also, of course, because the Koreans can play. So the casinos in Korea, they're mostly all the customers are tourists or like Korean Americans. But I think Koreans they didn't move into poker like much later. I think most of them, yeah.
Right. One little detail.
Some of them did the switch. I think, I don't know if you know this player Kim Gabyong, Love Dome.
What was he called in the game?
His StarCraft ID was Love Dome.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that player, no.
And actually, he made the switch at the same time as Guillaume and I, like way back in the day.
Okay.
He had a really big success with poker as well.
Right, one little detail I found in an old interview I just want to ask you about because it was so bizarre. I'd never heard of this before. You said that back in the day, if you went into a PC bang and people were playing StarCraft, a lot of people used to just use cheats, used to just use the map hack.
Yeah, a lot of them do that actually. It's I don't know. I think there's a lot. They don't think it's. I mean, like if it's not really a competitive thing, I don't think it's a big deal if they're not like playing a game with something at stake, right? But it's pretty weird. But actually, it's like there's one really weird thing also is poker that I know, like from security department on the poker site, and so they have like they have a way to catch players who kind of cheat or do something which are against the rules.
Okay.
And the funny thing is that actually like 80% of the players who cheat, they are losing in the game, and I think over 50% they don't even think they're cheating. Like obviously, like if I'm playing against my friend, then I should play the same as against anyone else to make the game fair for everyone. And so they would interview those guys, and yeah, of course I forwarded to him because he's my friend. So in their mind, they're not even trying to hide anything. They're not trying to cheat, and they're even losing money doing it. So it's like it's pretty weird. So I think like a lot of guys using map hack is probably not thinking it's like a big deal, right? I mean, I would guess if they're not playing a ladder game or if they're just playing like some random game, if they're using the map hack against a computer, I guess it's whatever. Who cares, right?
Right, one thing that I feel like is really misunderstood about professional poker is that there's two quick things I have to explain if no one's ever actually like followed the scene. One is that people are going to think it's just about like the World Series of Poker, that TV show that was very popular, and they're going to think, oh, it's about trying to be the world champion. I think it's like StarCraft, like I'm trying to be the world champion. It's like, I've always told people this, like by the time that show got huge, those fields are so enormous and there's so much luck in No Limit Hold'em. The best player almost never wins, basically doesn't ever win the world championship. I mean, nowadays, you usually get like an unknown person wins it. So in reality, poker as a sport is about like, you play enough tournaments that you can do well in the tournaments, right? It's like you get enough top fours, and then you win some, and then you also try to obviously make a lot of money from the cash games, right? It's different than esports in that regard.
Yeah, it's really different for sure. Like and tournaments and cash games, they're also quite different. I guess tournaments, the variance is just like the short-term luck is just insane. Like anybody can win a poker tournament, which is why it's such a popular game as well, because everybody has a real chance. That's actually how I started playing poker, because of Chris Moneymaker. You must have heard of his name. He's like,
of course,
random accountant, and he qualified for $30, and then he beat all the best for the main event, which is a $10,000 buy-in, and then he beat all the best poker players in the world and won it for the first tournament he played live ever. So it was like pretty much like the dream story that everybody could be him, and it's true that they could be if they get lucky enough. That's why poker is such a popular sport, right? Because in StarCraft, like nobody will pay 10,000 to play a tournament. Maybe like 4 or 5 people in the world. I'm not sure. Like back in the days, like even if like boxer players, probably like only Yellow and 1 or 2 guys which would pay to play a tournament with him. So the variance in the poker tournament is really, really high. In cash game, it's a little bit lower, and if you study really hard and you work really hard on your game, you can like play higher limits and become a winning player eventually at the highest limit. So it's very different than StarCraft for sure. And I think that's also one of the things I struggled with at the beginning, is that a lot of the time the result is not really just not that much in your control compared to StarCraft. Sure. StarCraft, of course, you can get an unlucky matchup or unlucky map sometime, but most of the time, if I would think like over 90% of the time, if you lose a game, is because the opponent was better than you. So either you made a mistake or he was better than you, and if you could practice more, maybe you could have done better. But in poker, like a lot of the time when you lose is when you play the best, because when you lose, when you lose early, it's usually when you have a much stronger hand than your opponent, and you are a big favorite to win, and that's how you get knocked out. So most of the time when you lose in poker, actually, you could have not done anything else. So it's quite difficult at the beginning. That was one of those things I kind of struggle with. It can be frustrating. Like the mental game, of course, it's in StarCraft. It's very important to stay strong as well and focused and not choke. But in poker, it's like a whole different level, because it's like there's unfair. Like I wouldn't say it's unfair because it's part of the game, but it's like there's unfair thing happening all the time. Like your dropship disappears, or like you lose some units just because. So it's very tough. Yeah.
This is one thing I want to ask you about, because in that sense, why was the appeal to play in tournaments then? Because, for example, in the early days of esports, there was another player, it was a famous Quake player, if people know that game, who I used to briefly know. It was a guy called Lakerman from Sweden, and he also did a similar thing, right? He was a really good Quake player, then he found online poker and he became really good. But here's the thing, no one else has ever heard of this guy after Quake, because he never went into big tournaments, he never tried to be a famous player. He literally really did just go, find the highest cash games and just beat businessmen all day long and just make millions and millions. And I'm sure he lives on some secret island now or some crazy life. Like, he did the opposite to you, basically, whereas you've tried to be like a pro in poker and be a big tournament champion. What's the appeal of playing the tournaments to you?
I mean, like, there's a few different things. The main reason why I play tournament also is because when I got sponsored back then by PokerStars, and they were tournament that gives you like a lot of exposure, and when part of the poker boom, like it's just a much more TV friendly format than cash game. So like a lot of the tournaments, that's where you could get exposure for your sponsor, and that's where you get sponsored for. So I would have to practice it, and it's quite enjoyable also, and as well. I mean, it's exciting, and like, of course, like most of the time you're gonna lose early and it's frustrating, but the big wins, they are like really something special, just because it's so rare. It's just like a more emotional. The emotional swings are much higher than cash game, because cash game pretty much is like pretty much the same thing every day. I mean, like, the swings are similar, right? It's not like when you're like a seasoned cash game player, you're used to the swing, and it doesn't really have any impact on. I mean, like, tournament player also doesn't have that much impact on your game, but cash game is a little bit more monotone, and it's also like slightly different skills. I mean, obviously, if you're a great tournament player or cash game player, it's interchangeable to some extent, but there are some specifics that you wanna learn for tournaments. And what I like about the tournament is that the field also, they're much more varied, because everybody has a real chance of winning. Like cash game, usually the better player win much faster. So if you play like really high stakes cash game, it's either like the best players in the world or some guys who are really rich and play as a hobby. Whilst tournament, you get like a much wider range of opponents and players. So it feels like a game that's a little bit more open to everyone. But yeah, I think I really loved when I first started, like the traveling part, and then you can be able to play poker tournaments everywhere in the world and discover the world. It was something that was also like really attractive and appealing to me.
The only thing is, as I mentioned, since poker became famous through all of the World Series of Poker stuff, and as you say, Chris Moneymaker making it seem like, wow, anyone can just get lucky and win. I actually think it makes people who don't know the other side of poker not realize that, like, yeah, there's a lot of luck if you just play one tournament. But the actual meta game of poker, it just feels like games like StarCraft. It gets very deep, and the top thinkers are right on the cutting edge, and you get swings where, you know, sometimes playing super conservatives, the vogue fashion. Sometimes, like a few years back, people online who were the high rollers used to all play super aggressive and go crazy, trying to go all in and everything. Like, did you get addicted to the meta side and studying the game of poker?
Yeah, the meta side is definitely crazy, and the studying is it's becoming to a point now. I don't know if you followed, but there are solvers, and they are like, actually, it's a little bit more about memorizing. Of course, it's a lot about memorizing the GTO approach in a lot of boards, and how to play, how you're supposed to play on a lot of situations. And it's definitely like extremely interesting. But I think the same for every game, right? The level becomes so high as time goes on, and there's so much information available now that you have to study like much harder than before. I mean, of course, I studied when I started playing poker, but when I first started, like, the study material was like 6 books, and like 4 or 5 of them, they were bad. So sure. That's all there was on poker. And nowadays there are like different poker courses online, and they have like poker seminars, and like those softwares that calculates the odd and the situation with like the ICM. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept that basically in tournament and cash game, what's the main difference is that the chips, the more chips you have, the least value they have, because in tournaments you're rewarded for surviving much more than winning.
Sure.
Because in cash game, pretty much like the chips, they always have the same value. So if you have like 51% chance of winning, you should go all in all the time. Because in the long run we will profit. But in cash game, a lot of the time, if your like tournament life is at stake, then you should play much tighter, because some other players, they're gonna be able to bust before you, and then if it's late in the tournament, there's a money pay jump. So it's basically like you have to play. You have to take much less risk in tournament, because if you finish with all the chips, you're not gonna get all the money, because that was the way it was back in the days, I think, when there were like 10 or 15 players. But now there are like in the World Series main events, there may be like 8,000 players, so they cannot give 80 million for first. That would be ridiculous. Nobody would play.
Right, one thing actually along those lines I wanted to ask you about was if this is where also like being from a pro gamer background helped, because another famous thing in poker tournaments is a lot of people who aren't the top pros, as soon as they get towards the different key phases of the tournament, like the bobble where you're going to start to make the prize money, and then as soon as they're getting into the top 10 or the final table, you can just see like these people are thinking about like, oh my God, if I get one more spot, I get 100,000 more. And you can tell as a result, it affects their play. Like a lot of them famously don't take advantage of certain the edges that they might have in a hand. Like they might play too conservative, right? In these scenarios, were you able to kind of use your experience to be more ruthless? Because if you just want to win the tournament, if you don't give a fuck about what the money is, if you just want to win, sometimes you should play really aggressively in those scenarios, right?
Yeah, for sure. You should play aggressively, especially if more players are scared of it. So if you know somebody qualified for satellites, they can qualify for, let's say, $100 for a tournament, which is 10,000, and the bubble is 15,000. They never want to bust then, basically. So they will fold even like last year, somebody in the main event in Vegas folded Pocket Kings to me pre-flop on the bubble because they didn't want to bust, and they showed it too. So of course, if you know those situations, then you can definitely take advantage of it. And of course, there are like a correct ways to play with ICM, but it's more about chip stacks compared to the pay jumps. But you should never think about the money as you should never affect your game, because and that's why a lot of players make mistakes. But that's totally understandable, because if they're like amateur player and they play for fun and they get into a situation where it's just so much money for them, it's just gonna affect their game for sure.
Right, as we've alluded to with the World Series of Poker, like it's not about being the best that makes you win the tournament. But I have noticed the greatest players, if they play enough tournaments, eventually they do win championships, etc. But even so, there's a lot of very good players. There's a lot of like amazing players, people who've won a lot of money, who haven't won like most of the big championships. Do you actually think that in poker, like, have you had luck in terms of winning some of the championships you've won? Have you just got a specialty for winning when you get to the final table? What do you think your strengths are?
I definitely got very lucky in poker. I mean, I might have won the same amount of money, but you could just like make a final table 3 times and get like, I don't know, 3rd, 4th, and 7th instead of winning. And like, I think I got really lucky because I got a lot more first place finishes in my big final table tournament. So I was very fortunate in that way. I think I guess like back in the days also maybe I had more heads up experience than some other players because I played it a lot online. But I still think I got pretty lucky. Yeah.
Right, even though it sounds like a cheesy like movie storyline, does the fact that you didn't win the big tournaments in StarCraft, but you got to be like a champion many times in poker, does that kind of like fill the hole that you couldn't in StarCraft? Is it satisfying in that way?
Yeah, it's satisfying. It's satisfying for sure. I mean, it's really awesome feeling to win a poker tournament. Winning a StarCraft tournament was also awesome feeling. I never won the biggest one in Korea, but of course I won a lot in France and in Europe back before I went there, and just like really satisfying feeling to be able to win everything and beat everyone. In poker, it's like, especially in StarCraft, I think it's more satisfying because most of the time when you win a tournament, you can say like you are the best, and I would think this statement is true like the vast majority of the time. Whereas in poker, it's I mean, everybody thinks they're the best when they win, but theoretically, like you are mostly the luckiest and sometimes the best, but it's hard. It's harder to quantify and to. It's not really. Everybody thinks they're the best when they're winning, but actually, it's very, very the case.
I've seen you say that like your favorite memory in poker is that really big first championship, the PokerStars Caribbean Adventure, the EPT one. Right, in this tournament, I noticed it's not that many years till you'd actually properly quit being a pro gamer. Like when you won this one, were you actually that good at poker at the time? Was that like a little bit of like earlier luck?
Yeah, I was really lucky for sure. I mean, like when you win a tournament with like 1,000 players, you always have to be extremely lucky, actually. Like, let's say, statistically, if you're the best player in the field by a lot, and there's 1,000 players, maybe you're gonna win the tournament. Like, if you're extremely good, like 1 in 50 times or 1 in 100 times. So just winning it, like, and definitely I wasn't the best player in the field back in the day. So I was extremely fortunate to win. Yeah.
When do you think you hit your peak in poker? Like, when did you get to the highest level you've been to? Do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's not so much. I'm pretty sure I'm a better poker player than I ever was, but the peak is more about how good I was compared to the opposition. So
Yes.
pretty much everyone is better every day in poker, right? So even though I'm the best poker player now, I think definitely I think from 2008 to 2012 is where I had the biggest edge over the field, I would guess, yeah.
If people don't know, when the poker boom happened in the 2000s, because like it's still big now, but it's not as like, it's like the money's still there, but there's not the same like mainstream exposure as it was. Like it was really popping off there. The interesting thing I find is that people probably wouldn't realize how much money was in the tournament circuit. Like all the top players were millions and millions and millions won. And if people wouldn't know, at your peak in terms of relative to the rest of the field, at one point in time, you were ranked 16th in prize money won in the history of poker. Right? That must seem surreal if you've been some guy who just came from a gaming background and you were, like you were saying, when you played in Korea, it's cool that the game was big in Korea because no one else in the world gave a fuck. Like it was, being a pro gamer was almost a joke job, like you said. Was it surreal to have this poker career?
It was pretty surreal, yeah, because it started just as a hobby, you know, like one of our friends introduced me to the game and I'm just like, okay, why not? I just play, it looks fun. And then I Googled this guy and I looked like, wow, Chris Moneymaker, this guy won 2.5 million. And I never expected to make it so big. I never expected to even become professional poker player, you know. It just became pretty gradually. Like I was playing poker, I was enjoying it a lot and I was good and I was like, gave me like money and freedom. And at the same time, StarCraft was like, I didn't have that much freedom with our deal and it was like so much harder. And so basically it was like, oh, I mean, I could like, yeah, if I was feeling like I still love the game of StarCraft, but I didn't want to, after you reach you're so close to the top, if I don't think I can make it to the top or be as good as before, it just didn't make sense to keep playing StarCraft and become like from like top 5 players in the world to top 10, next year top 20, and then it's like I don't want to even if I love the game, I don't want to compete if I cannot be good enough, I think. Whereas poker, yeah, of course, I was really lucky, and I was really good early on. I was able to play so many more hands, I think, because of the StarCraft background as well. Playing online when online became extremely popular, we got so much experience so quick compared to the other guy. But of course, the money list is quite important, but it's not so relevant because the tournament became so big as well. Basically, like when the poker boom happened, like every tournament that was like 5 or 10 years before, it was so small that if one guy went good for 1 year, it could be like if you win the World Series of Poker main event 1 year, you will be instantly like top 10
Sure.
in the money list, which is not necessarily reflecting the real skills, you know.
Yeah, of course. Well, along those lines, actually, even though a lot of people who've been pro gamers in esports have either played poker and had some success, or some of them have become pros, a lot of them are more like I said before, where it's like their whole thing was just to win the money. So they were just trying to be the best at whatever limits they were playing at and just try and have a cool lifestyle, basically. Not many have had the kind of actual tournament success that you've had. Does the amount of tournaments you mean? Are you the best ex-esports person to play poker, or is there someone who hasn't had as much success but it's better? Is there anyone out there that we should be aware of?
It's quite difficult. I think like as a professional esport player, probably, but like as a like guys who play StarCraft, there's so many, and like we don't even know everybody who plays StarCraft like semi-professionally, you know, like some guys who played, and like there are a lot of them who became really good at poker, so it's hard to keep track of all of them. And also, as you said, like it really depends on the lifestyle in your goal, and some guys can be silently crushing all the cash games in the world but staying anonymous because it's their preferred lifestyle and they're totally happy with it. And so the great thing about poker as well is you can pretty much get whatever you want from the game. You know, you can travel the world, play tournaments, and enjoy success and more popularity and fame. But if you want to stay anonymous and crush the biggest cash game everywhere, you can also completely do that. So it would be, I don't know, I would think like definitely the most famous one, but the best one, it wouldn't be fair to say I was the best one, because there might be like better player who played StarCraft before out there, you know.
Do any of the famous poker players ever come up to you and say, like on the side, by the way, I used to actually play StarCraft back in the day? Have any of them got like a secret gamer background?
Yeah, a lot of them played StarCraft before, actually. Yeah, for sure. And actually StarCraft, but you know what funniest thing is that now I'm so old school, and a lot of them is like, oh yeah, I play StarCraft 2 as well. I'm like, oh yeah,
right, okay.
For StarCraft 2, I was the 4 for StarCraft Brood War, you know, the old school one.
Sure. What about so in poker, I also saw that among all the championships you won, obviously most of them are in Hold'em because that's just the main way that poker's played. It's the most popular way. But I saw that you actually won your World Series of Poker bracelet in 7-card stud. Do you actually play that game? Because I know there's a lot of like old school players who play all the games and they're just degenerates. Like, do you actually play 7-card stud? Do you know that game well?
Now I know it better, but back then I barely knew it. You know, I only played online a few times, and then. But that year I was like, I know I want to win a bracelet. So basically, like, even if you're not this tournament I won, I think there were maybe 100. I forgot how many players actually. Let me check 1 second. I think there were 130 or something like that. Let me check exactly.
Probably a smaller amount since it's more of the side games, right?
Like,
yeah.
I was my thinking was that maybe I'm not that good at this game, but it's easier to beat 130 players in a game I'm not that good than 2,000 in a game I'm really good at. So. So I'm going to take my chance. And that's the first year I played it live, actually. The first year I played it live, and there was even some rules I was not completely sure of the first day.
Okay.
Like, because I played it online before, you know, and online, like, basically you just if something is not allowed, you don't have the option to do it.
Course,
so
yes.
It's a limit game, and there's cap in the number of bets you can make. So I didn't know how many times you could raise.
Right.
On how many? Let me see. 126 players. So basically, that year I started playing all the mixed game because I really wanted a bracelet. And like, even if I'm not that good at the game, I'm definitely like bottom 50% in the game, but I still have a decent chance to win a bracelet. Whereas if I'm like one of the best in a field of 2,000 players, it's still extremely difficult to win the bracelet. You know. But actually, those games I love the stud game is really interesting, and there are a lot of subtleties, and it's pretty cool and refreshing to play more games than No Limit Hold'em as well.
Is there a player where, when you play poker, like, listen, I know you've played a million tournaments, you've played all the best guys, etc. But is there a player who has like you described about Boxer, who has like an aura when you play them, and you think like, fuck, it's that guy, like this guy's just too good? Is there someone like that for you?
Not that much. I mean, it's quite different. Also in poker, you always like, I mean, you just always have like a decent chance of winning, you know. So there's no somebody like, there are like obviously like so many great players, but there's not somebody that I'll never get the same feeling of like, oh fuck, I'm gonna play Boxer again, and what am I gonna do? You know, it's not the same in poker, no. Even though there are like a lot of players who, I guess the one with the most. Two of the players with the biggest aura is my colleague Daniel Negreanu.
Sure.
Who is with me at GG Poker now, and probably Phil Ivey. Those are the two guys who are like
Classics,
the biggest
yes.
aura, but it doesn't affect me as much as some other players, I think.
If you play with Daniel Negreanu, is it like, I'm just asking this as a fan, is it like on television where one of the things he's really famous for is like he's amazing at talking while he plays, and he definitely fucks with people and does mind games because he always seems like he can tell you like what your hand is, and I can just see he just wrecks the amateurs with that. Like, does he really do that if you play with him?
Yeah, it's definitely like this. Like the thing you see on TV, it just happens, and I think he's much. I mean, he's definitely a great poker player, and he's really, he's one of the best player in the world. But he's even better against, as you said, against amateurs because they get like, he has this aura, and they watch him on TV, and they're like, oh my god, he's Daniel Negreanu. It's like when you play against boxer, it's like they already get like mind fucked just being at this table, and he's really good at like engaging conversation with them and putting them like in a difficult spot and like getting information from just talking to them. His style is just like, it's amazing for that. I really cannot do it. You know, I'm not like as talkative as him, and I can't.
You're more of a nerd, right?
Yeah, I'm totally different style, but Daniel is like, his style works the best. Like the WSOP event works the best because there's a lot of players who just come to Vegas for one weekend to enjoy a game of poker, and because he's also so well known in the world, it's like this effect that they think he's an awesome player, but you know, it's still a game of poker. He still has the same 2 cards as everyone, but they think he has like higher chance of winning than he actually has, so he takes advantage of it. Yes.
How have you managed to stay so dedicated to poker? Because a lot of people, especially people who had success, I mean, first of all, it's a little bit like the Korean StarCraft pros. Some of them, when they get the millions of dollars and the fame, they party too much. Obviously, there's a lot of drug use and stuff. Like people are in Vegas. People even call themselves degenerates usually if they're poker players. Like, how do you stay focused for so many years?
Well, I definitely did my fair share of partying and being degenerate as well, you know. But I love the game, and I love the fact that it's you can always learn, and you can always improve, and compared to StarCraft, I think it's much easier in the sense that you just have to be a field where to find a field or a game where you're a winner, whereas in StarCraft you have to be one of the best in the world. And poker is very challenging, but not in the same way as StarCraft. I think like you don't have like the mechanical, like StarCraft mechanically is like extremely difficult for everyone to stay on top. I remember when I was talking to Boxer a few years back in Korea, he was playing StarCraft 2, and then he had some invitational games, and he said he was practicing, and he's like, oh, I practiced like few days, and I hurt my body hurts, my wrist hurt, everything hurts everywhere because it's like so difficult. Whereas like I think poker, we have it's very challenging, but we have it very easy for that, in that regard, that you can compete when you're much older than in StarCraft. I think in StarCraft, if you're over 30, is pretty much dead. But now I think like players, they retire at like 25 or 26 or something. The StarCraft 2 players, right?
Now, the interesting thing is, a lot of people who were great players in esports who retire, often if you do interviews with them, they'll say like, oh, maybe one day I'll come back. But it's usually just like a naive dream. They won't really, because of how much you have to practice and how all the new kids, there's so many people play, etc. But the interesting thing I thought is, since you've still remained relevant in poker and been a massive player there, in the meantime, esports keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the prize money goes up and up and up. If it got big enough, like say in 10 years, you could really make like 50 million just from esports, would you be tempted to try another game if there was another, like if like StarCraft 4 was out or something? Would you be tempted to actually try and go pro again?
I'll be tempted, but realistically, to think I can be on top of the world, it's pretty unrealistic. But you never know. But you know, I played some Hearthstone competitively, and I think Hearthstone is definitely a game where you can. It's easier to be competitive because you don't have all these mechanics, and it's extremely time consuming, but and it's a tough game, but it's not nearly as tough as being a StarCraft pro. I mean, maybe I'll be tempted, but to be honest, I'm not sure I could even be close to be good enough. I played some StarCraft 2 when it came out, and I got crushed by some of the best French players back in the day. I think there was already Stefano back then, so yes. At least it's not that bad. It's not that bad, you know. I played just like one exhibition game, and I tried to play random, but it might be possible, but then you definitely have to be full time. It's not possible to do like to compete in two different domains at the same time, and there are to be sacrifices to be made, you know.
This might sound like a strange question, but actually, since you bring up Stefano, I had a topic along these lines, which is, Is there something about French people, right? Because a friend of mine in Counter-Strike, he's half French and his dad is French. He's called Semler, who's a Counter-Strike commentator, right? And basically, I was once talking to his dad, and he was asking me, like, why are the French Counter-Strike teams always so up and down? Like, why are they champions some month and then the next month they go out last place or whatever? And I told him basically, oh, well, actually, behind the scenes, they're quite infamous for, like, they all think of themselves basically as, like, artists rather than, like, sportsmen. Like, they think, like, oh, I'm just good at the game and it's about passion and if I feel it that day. And he said, oh, this is actually something from French culture. Like, he told me the story basically of this player called Yannick Noah in tennis in the 70s. And he said when this guy became like French Open champion and was winning, then he just started partying and he was with all the hottest women and like he would play half the time, but he wasn't as dedicated as, you know, like Bjorn Borg or whoever the fuck his rivals were. And so he didn't win as much as he could. And I've noticed Stefano carried this on in StarCraft. He was legendary for partying. In Counter-Strike, it's the case. You actually seem quite unique in that sense that you've been so dedicated to the things you've done. Like you've had a pretty good work ethic, right?
Yes, pretty good. I think, as I said earlier, you know, going to Korea so young, it definitely had a good influence on me for that. So there are two things, like going to Korea and also like I was so passionate about the thing, it doesn't really feel like work. And when something starts to feel like work and I'm like forcing myself to do things because I have to, I just usually try to, it's just like a sign that it's maybe time to switch to something that I'm more passionate about and feels, of course, I've been like, you know, when I was like practicing StarCraft and playing and being on a computer like 14 or 16 hours a day, it could seem like great work ethic, but to be honest, it was just fun. So it's like it felt like the thing I wanted to do the most at the time, right? So, but now of course I do things like I work on some things that are not necessarily always the most fun, but living in Korea and opposed to France is a very different mentality. You're right. It's like there's the drive to succeed it's there for some French people, of course, but I think in general rule, like the Korean mentality, they just work so hard and can be good, but sometimes it can be, I don't know, sometimes they work too hard, I think.
At the end of this interview, do you have like a final message or maybe someone from esports you want to say hello to or thank? I
mean, I want to say thanks. It's like, you know, what's really amazing is that there's so many fans that like the StarCraft fans, so many fans remembers me from StarCraft 1 for like pretty much everywhere I go in like poker tournaments or when I go to esports event just as a spectator, just to have fun. There's like so many fans that come out, and I would really, the StarCraft community is so loyal. It's really amazing. It's really amazing to see, and I would like to thank all of them and thank Team Liquid, of course, also for the community that they created. It's just like it's amazing. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Pronogo, Alexander Rao, Andreas Crockneys, Eric Hillestad, Hades, J-Dubs, the Puyallup Tribe, Tobias Bernasconi, Vatrisam, Zinged, James Peterson, and as always, a special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Do you want to ask a question in my monthly video AMA? Do you want teasers? See who the upcoming guests are going to be? Maybe you'd like to take part in one of those monthly donated discussions with me about esports. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrolluminati today in the Patreon link in the description box below.